Several days ago, I was introduced to a theory on Reddit regarding the nature of the Rock of Ravito in the Pitioss Ruins. The crux of the theory is this. The Rock of Ravito was a pyre on which IFRIT burned the corpse of his lover, Eos, goddess of the dawn, and Pitioss was designed by IFRIT to explain how he attempted to rescue her from the underworld. I found some aspects of this theory very convincing. It's easy to see IFRIT's horns and a single outstretched wing in the shape of the Rock of Ravito, and the idea that Pitioss was designed to tell a story is, at the very least, fascinating enough to warrant further exploration. On the other hand, I find it incredibly unlikely that aspects of FF15's mythos that stand in direct contradiction to the rest of the game would be relegated to an optional dungeon that much of the game's audience could find unplayably difficult. As such, I decided to investigate Pitioss myself. The results were significantly less shocking, but there are still some nice surprises for those of us who have followed the FF15 project since its introduction as Final Fantasy Versus 13. Let's start by considering the various figures and symbols that appear in Pitioss. The most prevalent figure is the demon, who appears in 4 separate places. Initially, he is seen locked in a cage in the entry hall. There is a treasure chest in front of him. In order to open the sealed door to Pitioss depths, you must raise the cage around the demon, make a ball land in front of him, use that ball to destroy a giant statue of a bearded god, and use the path created by the bearded god's destruction to launch a second ball to break down the sealed door. It's easy to connect this figure to IFRIT and the ball to Meteor based on this interaction alone. The bearded god is trickier. The Reddit theory associated it with Titan, but I feel that Rama is more appropriate. Rama has a beard while Titan lacks one, and the image of the bearded god's head resting on the ground could be related to the dungeon designer's original concept of Rama appearing in the clouds as nothing but a head. Another point to consider with regards to the bearded god is that Pitioss appears to draw on classical and traditional imagery from our own world as opposed to Eos-specific imagery. The demon looks far more like a traditional demon than it does IFRIT, even though it's clear that's what it's meant to represent. The bearded god closely resembles classical portrayals of Zeus wielding lightning, which would again associate him with Rama rather than Titan. The next figure of note is the goddess, whose statue can be seen from several places in Pitioss. This statue exists at the very center of the dungeon's most unusual challenge, an extended platforming section in which gravity shifts constantly, camera control is restricted, and entire sections of level geometry rotate as you move. Before the final approach, she appears as the light at the end of a long tunnel, but once Noctis reaches her, her statue leans backwards and lies prone, opening the path forward and allowing access to the Genji gloves at her navel. Anyone who's familiar with the FF13 sub-series or the Fabula Nova Crystallis mythos should find this imagery familiar. The concept of a goddess in the realm of the dead, who chooses a successor before falling into chaos, is critical to both the initial mythos and FF13's implementation of it. And given FF15's historical ties to the FNC project, it's plausible that Pitioss was designed to demonstrate the form taken by FF15's remaining FNC connections. For the record, I don't believe there is sufficient evidence to assume a canon name for this figure. The name Etro was likely abandoned in the shift away from FNC, and if the name Eos was ever used as a name for a goddess rather than as a name for the planet itself, I am no longer able to find a direct source demonstrating such a use. Believe me, I tried. It's not implausible that our unidentified goddess is, in fact, an incarnation of the planet, but such an association relies heavily on speculation. 2 other figures exist in Pitioss, both of which exist in the same room. One of these figures is a massive, deadly contraption with a giant skull out in front and rows of rotating spikes underneath, which I will henceforth call the Reaper. The Reddit theory associates this contraption with Doom Train, but I feel that it's much more reminiscent of a Combine and therefore more likely represents the harvesting of souls. The other figure, a hand contorted into a very unnatural position, supports this reading more than the alternative. If it were in fact asking for tickets, its palm should be facing upwards. Apart from the statues, there is one other figure to consider, which I will henceforth call the protagonist. The protagonist is represented by Noctis' own actions in exploring Pitioss and does not appear in the dungeon itself, with one minor exception. The warp effects that appear when Noctis is returned to a checkpoint are purple, rather than his standard blue, and could reflect the nature of the protagonist. Before moving on, there are several other symbols of note in Pitioss that we ought to consider. One is the spiral of blue butterflies that appears in several of Pitioss's areas, which could represent souls. The red spikes that appear in all but one area are another. Given their mechanical function, their presence most likely indicates the presence of death. Treasure chests, of course, represent the concept of reward. The non-Euclidean geometry of the innermost sanctum naturally represents chaos. And, finally, the streaks and smears of black found throughout the area likely reflect the influence of the STARSCOURGE, given their visual similarity to the black blood associated with those infected. Now that we have our cast of characters in order, let's consider the nature of the story in which they appear. Pitioss is unusual insofar as it attempts to tell a story by guiding one's movement through a space. It appears to signify changes to new scenes by shifting to a different area, general challenges within a scene through the nature of its obstacles, and specific actions only through the use of colored switches. As there appears to be no mechanical difference between orange and white switches, the color of a switch likely represents the identity of the one performing that action. In particular, the white switches appear to be used when the protagonist acts for his own benefit, while the orange switches are generally used in conjunction with the ball representing meteor, and likely represent the actions of IFRIT. With that in mind, let's continue. As I mentioned earlier, when you reach Pitioss's entry hall for the first time, you will find several figures with which you must interact in order to open the path forward. There is a statue of the demon in a cage, who the protagonist must figuratively free with a white switch. In front of the demon is a treasure chest containing an elixir, a promise of healing in return for the protagonist's help. Two switches, a white switch and an orange switch, trigger a ball to shoot out and land in front of the demon. You must jump from the demon's head to this ball and trigger another orange switch, which destroys the statue of the bearded god and allows you to access the orange switch that will launch a ball to break down the sealed door. Along this path, there are black markings on the wall. Blue dragonflies appear on one of the room's pillars. What can we tell from all of this? First, the protagonist started out as an ally of IFRIT, likely due to a promise of healing if he were to free IFRIT. For his troubles, he was either rewarded or rewarded with entry into the underworld. Second, IFRIT's use of the meteor and the STARSCOURGE was intended to break down a sealed gateway, and he had to fight Rama in order to use it. This use of meteor is, of course, easy to connect with the FNC mythos, in which the fal'Cie sought to use the deaths of humans to gain entry into the unseen realm in order to kill Etro. Pitioss' second area focuses on a massive globe, which starts to rotate once you pass some spinning columns of spikes and trigger a white switch. In order to proceed, you must make your way to the top of the globe and jump down into a narrow opening in the middle of a field of spikes, which triggers an orange switch that causes a ball to shoot forward and provide footing to begin the next set of jumps. When you are on top of the globe, you can see the demon statue facing away. If you follow its gaze, it appears to be looking down at the goddess statue from afar. This, I believe, is the first hint that the demon is not the story's protagonist. While IFRIT is responsible for the meteor that grants the protagonist passage, he's already focused on the goddess when the protagonist enters the realm of the dead. As in the entry hall, there are blue dragonflies near the entrance to this room, designating it as part of the usual path taken by departed souls. The protagonist, I believe, is one such soul, and he made his way into the realm of the dead due to IFRIT's machinations. The third area is marked by a massive statue of the demon lit in red, holding a prawn antenna. There are 5 sealed doors in the room, the first of which is opened by an orange switch on the floor, not too far in front of the demon. Each sealed door contains a different sort of challenge, each of which mimics the movement of water in some way. The first sealed door contains a number of spiked blocks moving up and down in a fluid motion, and once you reach the top of the door frame, an orange switch opens the second sealed door. Having been thrown into a sea full of dead souls by IFRIT's actions, the protagonist struggles to the surface, only to be thrown back in. The second and third sealed doors are connected. The former contains spinning columns of spikes, which you must first jump past, then jump on, while the latter contains wheel mechanisms. Like the first seal door, these challenges mimic water-related phenomena, like whirlpools and waves, and the path is cleared by an orange switch that opens the door across from it. The protagonist continues to struggle free, but IFRIT's desire to open a path forward interferes once more. The fourth seal door reflects yet another aspect of water, requiring you to stand on moving platforms while avoiding walls of spikes, culminating in some very narrow passageways in the lead-up to the final orange switch of the area. The protagonist must once again avoid the souls of the dead, this time while being carried on a current, until IFRIT opens the final door. The door in question is strange, even by the standards of Pitioss. It rotates around in an arc, and must be ridden on in order to reach the next area. Again, it gives the impression of water, possibly a waterfall. Once it drops you off, however, the water imagery vanishes. The fourth area is dominated by the Reaper, a nearly room-sized device with a massive skull face on the front and the appearance of a combine. Every challenge in this area requires you to properly navigate the Reaper. You must avoid the spiked columns that comprise its blades, duck into gaps within its mechanism, ride inside it, and eventually ride on top of it, before you can reach the orange switch at the far end of the room. There are blue butterflies on the metal bars running over the room. This is part of the path taken by departed souls, likely their final destination before being harvested and returned to the mortal realm as new souls. The protagonist desperately avoids this fate, only to find himself forced onward and trapped when IFRIT opens the door. The fifth area lacks nearly all of the symbols that appear in the previous areas. There are no blue butterflies, no spikes, no balls, no demon, and no reaper. In their place is chaos, bizarre, non-Euclidean geometry viewed from awkward perspectives, 2.5-dimension platforming on moving platforms, and an entire section of level geometry that is not only non-Euclidean, but also rotating. Throughout the area, you can see glimpses of the goddess statue. As you reach the area's final challenge, she appears as the light at the end of a very long tunnel. Once you reach her, however, things fall apart. Landing on her chest causes her to fall backwards into a prone position, and while you can retrieve a pair of Genji gloves from her navel, the only way to progress is to fall down the length of her sword and sustain massive damage. As mentioned earlier, this imagery is highly reminiscent of Etro in the Fabula Nova Crystallis mythos. Our protagonist is the one blessed with her powers as she falls, as represented by the Genji gloves. The Genji gloves, by the way, could provide a hint as to the nature of our protagonist. Genji is a surname given to members of the Japanese imperial family who were demoted to nobility. The sixth area begins with a long elevator ride, then continues with a number of narrow metal beams and broken metal grates that retain the non-Euclidean character of the previous area's platforms. You are quickly faced with a statue of the demon, with newly sunken facial features, standing in your way, and must make your way around him. Eventually, you come to an area of stonework, but there are STARSCOURGE marks everywhere, and you're forced to jump down from the end of a staircase leading nowhere. Thankfully, there's a white switch there, and a door opens to let you out into the exit hall. This area, more than anything, is why I cannot see the demon as the hero of the story. If he's the one trying to escape, why would his figure bar the way forward? Instead, I believe this area represents the protagonist confronting an infected IFRIT before following him and his trail of STARSCOURGE out of the underworld. The final area trades the challenges of the Void for challenges more reminiscent of those seen in earlier areas. Most notably, there are pathways of spikes to walk through and fields of spikes to jump over. Chaos has given way to the renewed specter of death. The protagonist desperately searches for white panels to open the doors to the Void. His path leads him past STARSCOURGE markings, through the paths of the dead, past treasure chests full of healing items and coins. It forces him to fight, and eventually requires him to rely on the assistance of IFRIT, an orange panel marked by the STARSCOURGE, to continue on. Behind the door opened by IFRIT is a treasure chest containing a platinum bangle, an item that gives its user greater capacity to withstand damage. Once the final door has been opened, the protagonist is able to make his way to an elevator, one final white switch, and leap out of the underworld to freedom. Near the exit is a black hood, an item imbued with dodging abilities, similar to that of the Line of Lucis. With all of this in mind, one has to wonder, who is the protagonist anyway? He's affiliated with the Line of Lucis and glows purple when he warps. He allied himself with IFRIT. He received the blessing of the goddess, but found himself stripped of his royal heritage. He was rewarded for his journey with healing powers and the capacity to withstand heavy injuries. And finally, he's associated with the STARSCOURGE. In other words, Pitioss isn't just the tale of IFRIT and the goddess, it's also the origin story of a certain man of no consequence, listed by the official strategy guide as the servant of IFRIT. Why in the world are Arden's powers so much more comprehensive than the rest of the Lucis Caelum line? Well, this is one explanation. And for what it's worth, there's no one in universe more motivated to torment Noctis and the player with a massive, frustrating death trap in which it's impossible to actually die than the guy who already inflicted a similarly frustrating yet survivable death trap on us. Chapter 13, anyone? Details about the powers granted to the Lucis Caelum line are surprisingly limited, even taking into account the information contained in FF15's Ultimania. While the Oracle's powers are known to have come from Bahamut, the nature of the Power of Kings is left ambiguous both within FF15 and its Ultimania. It's not difficult to imagine that the Royal Arms, whose presence is associated with FNC-like soul fragments, are connected to a goddess of death. The nature of the crystal is even more intriguing, as the Ultimania explains that it emerged from the planet as opposed to being created by the Astrals. If our unidentified goddess is the planet, the crystal itself could have been her gift. And, even if the Ring of the Lucii was created by the Astrals, it would be a tool used to control her power. This, I believe, is where FF15 and Versus 13 connect. Etro seems to have been at the heart of whatever Versus 13 was intended to be, and is likely to have been the source of all of Noctis' creepy death-related powers, the eyes that see the light of expiring souls, the royal arms, the ring, and likely even the crystal itself. Even the Oracle's power could be linked to FF15's FNC heritage, given that the power of the stars she wields, the ability to hold back the STARSCOURGE, has more in common with Etro's relationship with Chaos than the Astral's own capabilities. In other words, while FF15 can no longer sustain a death goddess in its surface text, her shadow still lingers in Pitioss, the true figure hidden in sleep. It's difficult to use the STARSCOURGE markings to tell a specific story given how prevalent they are throughout Pitioss. It seems fair to assume that, while certain pathways are more heavily marked than others, the markings are often intended to represent a general infection of the underworld. This is consistent with Arden's ability to make demons of the dead, and of the Japanese name for demons, Shigai, being a homonym of the Japanese word for corpse. As for IFRIT, his final appearance suggests that he was among the infected. If this is the case, he would have fought the other Astrals while enthralled to the Scourge, until Shiva shattered him. This would explain both why Arden was able to summon IFRIT, and why IFRIT never even attempted to speak on his own behalf. While it's often amusing to engage in resistant readings of texts, it's unlikely that such a reading would be revealed through a piece of content with which most of the audience is unlikely to engage. As such, it's more natural to interpret the events referenced by Pitioss in light of both FF15's historical ties to Fabula Nova Crystallis and the surface-level facts provided by the game in its supplementary materials. The connection with Arden is, for obvious reasons, the most tenuous part of this theory. Whether he was intended to fulfill the protagonist role or not, however, I believe that Pitioss is intended to tell of a human journey into the underworld and the nature of the Lucis Caelum line, as opposed to a tale about the gods alone. I'd like to extend a very special thanks to XCV on YouTube, who very graciously allowed me to use footage from his Pitioss Ruins walkthrough when making this video. This walkthrough is a fantastic resource for anyone investigating Pitioss, and I relied on it heavily when reviewing parts of the dungeon that required too much focus to think about symbolism. I'd also like to thank Perona77 on Reddit, who posted the theory that sparked my interest in the story told by the Pitioss Ruins, as well as the Twilight Mexican on the Lifestream.net, who posted translations of sections of the FF15 Ultimania. Finally, I'd like to thank Square Enix for developing Final Fantasy XV, and for not completely abandoning the Versus 13 project, and Yoko Shimomura for the game's fantastic soundtrack.